Professor Mott and fellow classmates, my name is David Sergi. I thank you for joining me this evening as I present to you my action plan about the systems and self-reflection of what we have been speaking about for the greater part of the last 8 weeks. Over the next few slides, I'm going to be telling you about my community and my journey to ultimately defining myself as a leader and using our coursework to really speak about my vision and how the role I play within my community is ultimately shaping the next generation of leaders. So I do want to start off by speaking about the influences to my leadership approach as it currently is. My past and a lot of my journey to Washburn has been shaped by past leaders that I've had, past roles I've held within organizations, employers that I felt didn't meet my values and my ethics. And that's why I'm in your class, that's why I'm studying communication and leadership, really is to reflect about maybe failures I've had or as a leader myself, or failures I felt my bosses have had. And that's why my research is so heavily focused on improving organizations as a whole and seeing how we can improve individually as leaders and then the role we play in a larger organization. You know, when I talk about my past, I'm very open about I've had leaders who I felt have failed me. They didn't involve teams. They didn't lead by example. Maybe they showed up late. Maybe they've stolen from organizations. Maybe they weren't a positive influence. They didn't set an example for the future. And that's really where my journey takes place. You know, when we took, one of the greatest parts in our textbook was from Northhouse on page 211, when he says an authentic leader is shaped and reformed by the critical events that acted as triggers in growth. Really what they're saying is our past will predict our future. My past has been largely shaped by failures, and I've learned from them. And what I'm going to show you on my next slide is part of that journey. And you know, I've determined what I need to do as a leader and what those previous leaders needed to do better. When I talk about how I can be an authentic leader, I'm talking about collaboration. I think if you have a team of 3 people, 6 people, or a large organization of 1,000 people, it starts with collaboration, getting everybody's input, bringing a team together, people who are diverse, whether their age, background, whether what their roles, it's giving everybody an equal voice in an organization. Being a positive influence is one of the cornerstones of my leadership style. I think we need to speak positively to each other. We have to be role models to each other. I think senior management has to be a role model to the people at the lowest levels, and I think the people at the lowest levels have to be a positive influence on senior management. That is the cornerstone. It is how we speak to other, how we speak to each other, how we engage each other. I've had managers in my own past who disrespected. Maybe they used language that brought people down, didn't motivate them. We talk about community. Community is a very important aspect of an organization and a leadership style. What you need to do is bring people together. I think when somebody leaves an organization, maybe they move on to a different role, you have to have the network within your community to go out and recruit and bring new voices in. Community is having business relationships. Community is having the voice of the customer or the consumer. How does the community feel about your organization? What you want to do is if you have happy employees and you're a good leader, they're going to bring others to work for you. They're going to tell you what kind of great products you have. I've worked for companies where, you know, the customer knew the management at that organization weren't treating their staff right, and that transcended into the community. It left a bad taste in people's mouth even before they walked in that door. So community is a big aspect with a lot of different elements in it. But I think to be a leader, an authentic leader, and what I've seen in my past is if a leader does not involve the community and understand who are the people outside those doors, that really will lead to problems. And what I always say is inspire. I think a leader has to inspire. We aren't always in roles for 30 or 40 years. Once in a while, you're in somebody's life for a short amount of time. Maybe it's looking over somebody's resume. Maybe it's asking your colleague what they want to do 5 or 10 years from now. You have to help each other create a picture. Maybe it's inspire not even just in the workplace, but personal goals. Maybe it's encouraging somebody to get back to school like somebody did for me. Maybe it's inspiring them to go home and be a better mother and a father and a son and a community member. I think we all have to raise each other up. And this is part of being a leader, whether it's in a workplace or being a best friend. And that's just the cornerstone of my belief in leadership. And what you're going to see when I talk about my community is that one of the hardest parts that you can find is finding an organization that meets your values. Meaning, the place that you work for, do they meet who you are as a person? And I think that's the fundamental shift, and I think that's what we've been learning about in the last 8 weeks. And that's not always the case. I think it can be hard. I've worked for companies that didn't meet my values. I've worked for somebody who told me, don't get to know your staff on a personal level because you're going to want to fire them someday. I don't believe that's the case. I believe you should get to know your staff. I think you should be ingrained with your staff. And I think that is part of, being a leader. And ultimately, that's where my code of ethics comes. And it is hard. I think it took me a very long time to work for an organization that met my ethical and personal values. And I think I would encourage you watching as well to find that. And if you're not there yet, know that it can get better, but you do have to stick to your core beliefs. These are my core beliefs. I won't work for another organization that does not meet this criteria because I know what it's like. I think what I'm going to start to talk about on my next slide in depth really is about my healthcare community. I work in healthcare. I work for a large hospital here in South Florida. It's a complex organization. And really what I'm going to be doing is kind of bouncing around a few different slides here to bring you in depth into why I work in a thriving organization that matches my ethical and my values. In a hospital, it's made up of many different teams. And all those teams have to come together. We all have the same end result: patient satisfaction, positive outcomes. 2 things: is the patient happy, and are you getting positive outcomes? That is going to mean many different things, and I'm going to show you that. And I'm going to show you how we have to every single day break down barriers, that we have to have symbolic relationships. We have to have a community status, meaning the community within the hospital, each individual role has to work together. And I'm also going to show you about the social network. We talk about in the book the cups of change. What is that defining moment where innovation takes a leap, where change happens? And I'm going to show you why the system that's actually put in place by the federal government does work, and why the laws push innovation. They don't give you a choice not to. It's hard, but we actually have a really good system in place federally that encourages communication and to break down the barriers. If you go to my next slide, I'm going to very quickly educate everyone a little bit about healthcare in my community. At the end of the day, every hospital gets a grade, A, B, C, D. But within that grade, there's a lot of different elements that many different teams are responsible for. So when a patient leaves a hospital, you're presented with a survey questions. So some of the questions could be quality of communication with the nurses, responsiveness of hospital staff, pain management, communication about your medication, how clean was the hospital, and ultimately you get an overall rating. But what I want you to understand, why I'm really speaking about this as a healthcare community, is all these different categories that a patient will rate. These are all individual teams. Communications of a nurse, those are probably over 100 nurses that ultimately come of that. Doctors, that's another team. Pain management, that's another specialized team. So what I'm talking about is you have all these different teams that ultimately will come down to a certain percentage. And that's important to understand, because what you need to do in healthcare is, on a larger organization, this final score is mine. What we all need to do is all work with each other and say, how could I elevate your scores? How could you help me elevate mine? What is my team doing right that I could help you? And this is just a perfect example of why we all drive innovation. You know, if you could look at one department that has a 21%, another department that has a 9%, what we try to teach and what the system itself does teach is to work with each other. What is your department doing right that maybe another department can rise up their scores and ultimately will give everyone a better outcome? And this is a matter of life and death, you know, working together. I think that's why, you know, breaking down these boundaries and innovating. You know, we even talk about how is the voice given to diversity. Within all these teams are people in all different skill levels. We have neurosurgeons to janitors, you know, and we all need to work together. You know, everybody has a voice on the team, no matter the age, their race, their employment status, full-time, part-time. If you go to the next slide, what I'm also going to show you is historically of how these numbers are broken down. And once again, the system is designed for motivation. So every month, this is an example from 2009, and then it goes on to February, March, and you can look at the whole year on every different category. And the numbers don't lie. And what the system is designed to do is to show you a complex system. This is why I think this is the best example to even talk about the nexus that we read about, you know, positive leadership and relationships within the entities, and also constraints. You know, a chart like this might look scary, but at the end of the day, it's about people. It's about teams working together. It's about micro teams working on a larger network. My team, for example, I work in guest relations, but there's 10 of us. The hospital in general has over 1,000 employees. I cover a tiny segment of one of these micro numbers. But ultimately, I know if I want, yes, a nice bonus at the end of the year, if I want to work in an A-rated hospital, not a C-rated hospital, it doesn't matter if my team is performing well or my team is finishing in a 70 percentile. I want everybody to finish in the 70 percentile. That's how we're going to be rewarded. And that's where I think a lot of challenges come, and that's I think why this class was important as well. It's how do we change the mentality of a team working together? I know a lot of people in the class work in a university, and it's easy to say our department's doing well, but how is the university doing? And I think that's the mindset that we really want to change, and that's the reason why this book is important. And even it has changed. I could, you know, I to this day I sent an email about a concern that I had. It was a safety concern about a department that's not my department, but it was something that I felt comfortable, and the culture encourages that. If you see a concern or a problem that could influence patient safety, and even if you're unsure about it, they have a culture of you could raise a red flag and you're not going to be penalized. You have the authority to question somebody. Because at the end of the day, we're all striving for the same thing, which is a lot of green boxes, which is a lot of positive interactions and a lot of innovation. But it does take culture to change that. It does take people understanding what the nexus is. And you know, what we talk about in a lot of the book is, you know, are we at a point of disarray, or is it more a level thriving environment? And that's where I'm lucky to work in, a thriving environment that isn't shaky or scattered, because I think largely, like I mentioned earlier, the system itself requires you to work within rules and regulations. And I'm lucky to work for them, but to work within these rules. I've worked for organizations that didn't have stringent rules, that every department didn't have matrix, and it can get confusing. And I think I'm quite lucky in my career at this point to work for an organization that has structure, where we motivate each other outside of our own little cubicle. So, but also an organization that meets my ethical values, like I spoke about a little while ago, where community is a huge aspect. How does the community view us? How do we interact with the community? How do we speak to each other? Are we speaking positively to each other? Are we a positive influence in each other's lives personally and professionally? Those are the driving factors that motivate me. And just so happens in healthcare, that lines up as well. But this is not easy work, and it does take a leadership style to reflect that. To go on to my next slide, I will start to talk about, my action plan. And really, my action plan is more or less defined by, I think, a lot of really good information that was in the books about there is a path. There is a path to be a leader in an environment that teaches you to maybe not always think positively about change in culture and innovation, but you can create teams. And my number one thing on my action plan is to be an outsider. I think you have to have an outsider mentality. I think our generation, you can change your world. We're seeing in every aspect where, we have the Ubers and the Netflix. Those are just some examples in the book, but we can think about it, everywhere. Even small businesses are changing how they interact with customers. But they're outsiders. They're going against the status quo. They're thinking, how can they disrupt the system? In healthcare, some of the best ideas that we've had and some of the greatest innovations we've had have come from people like me who came from the outside. They were able to take a risk. They were able to diversify their workforce and not just hire not another kind of career healthcare worker, but they hired somebody from the business world to come in. That's why I think we always have to have the outsider mentality. Your customer is always going to be thinking different. They're always going to be seeing what else is out there. So you really have to not lose sight of that. Influence the community is just a big part of my action plan. In healthcare, which I work in, which I study a lot, we're always looking at other hospitals. What's the hospital down the road doing? Today I was doing research on a hospital in Boston that has phenomenal scores. What are they doing right? They're out there in the community. They're part of our health network. We could form relationships with that hospital in Boston, but with one email. Say, what are you doing? How can we provide better healthcare across the whole United States by working together? It's a shared interest. But I think you have to be able to have that mentality, and that's exactly what this book teaches, is to think bigger. How are you part of a larger web? Promote innovation. I've stumbled early on in my career where I felt innovation had to be kept to you. If you did something great, don't tell the other person in the other department. Don't tell them how you did it. And that's the wrong mentality. Your success is everyone's success. And that is something I've had to learn, and I think it's fundamental that, if you're doing good things and your team is motivated, the department a little ways down the hallway doesn't have that same energy, that same enthusiasm. What are you doing right? How could you shift it so everybody is thriving? And when we talk about long-term strategies of my plan, it's not just in my healthcare community, but also my personal life. How do I bring my positivity? How do I bring my research? A lot of what we've been learning about in the last 8 weeks has been being a better leader. And how do we create followers? How do we create people that want to be like us? How do we be a positive role model? And that's what really struck me about this class. It was the idea that we're all leaders. It's not one person at the top or one person leading a small team. It's all within. And it's within because we all have a code of ethics and a code of values that we're maybe not willing to vary from. And when we discover that, we can actually all be leaders. And that is, I think, the beauty of this class, and why I'm lucky to have been in it with you, is because not only have I been able to really dig deep and to see why my healthcare community is working and thriving, it is because of the diversity, the innovation, the positive difference. We were able to break down the constraints of a traditional organization and use the model that was given to us to the best of our ability. And that's what I hope a lot of you get from watching this video is, what are the constraints within your organization? How do you break them down? How do you look at the barriers and realize that you could overcome them using communication and leadership? I think that's what I wanted you to get out of this video and this demonstration, and it's why I really enjoyed being in your class in the last 8 weeks, is I have a better action plan because of you and because of what we learned. And I thank you for your time.